If there's any historical people that have dealt with difficulties throughout their time on this earth, it's gotta be the often maligned Jewish people. The Jewish religion in Crusader Kings 3 received a slight revamp in a recent update, with certain unique faith choices added to the Jewish faith to determine their view on the holy texts of Judaism. For the most part, these act as ways to determine interfaith hostility and don't contribute much, but there is one which is a controversial and therefore interesting addition. The Samaritans in-game are regarded as a Jewish faith in CK3, albeit every other Jew sees them as evil. I can't speak to the modern-day sensibilities of Jewish and Samaritan relations, but one thing I do know is that Samaritans are basically not even Jewish as far as Jews are concerned. In the game, Samaritans are the only non-pluralist Jewish faith, and they also get some slight bonuses in return for being a complete pariah amongst their fellow Jews. The central difference between Samaritans and Jews is that rather than Jerusalem being the holiest place on earth for the chosen people, the Samaritans put it in Mount Gerizim, which is in Nablus today. The game does in fact represent this, with Nablus being a holy site rather than Jerusalem. Beyond that, Samaritans reject every holy book that isn't the untouched Samaritan Torah. I couldn't tell you the details beyond that since I only did some cursory Wikipedia browsing to even figure out this stuff. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to mostly use Samaritan and Jew interchangeably, so if that upsets any Orthodox Jews, or one of the, 840 Samaritans in the world, I'm sorry, and I'd appreciate if you could educate me in the comments. Without further ado, this is Gavriel of Urdun. He's a Samaritan Bavlim that was entrusted by the Fatimid Caliphate to rule over the somewhat rebellious Samaritans of Acre. The idea is that Gavriel, being Samaritan himself, can represent the Caliph somewhat autonomously and keep tensions down. Gavriel was chosen by the Fatimids for his calm demeanor and for his talent as a mystic scholar amongst the Samaritans. He's well respected by both parties. Gavriel is hoping to carve a path for his own people without too much strife by staying under the radar and working in his own best interest without bringing down reprisals upon his people. It's a careful game he'll have to play, as his title as Samaritan representative could be stripped away by any subsequent Caliph on a whim. In his mind, the beautiful mountains of Israel often materialize, tantalizing him, guiding him towards his destiny. It would be scary to stand against the very rulers that gave him this power, but can the Samaritans ever be fulfilled if they can't live in their holy land? Regardless of their ambitions, the Samaritans of Acre are looking to their new leader for guidance. The personal friendship between the Caliph and Gavriel should keep them safe for now, but the world evolves, and with it, will the Samaritans have to evolve too. In case you're wondering, I used the Entitled mod to create this setup where Acre is Babylon and Samaritan at game start. I rarely use mods, but this one is amazing for constructing scenarios. I used the regular CK3 debug mode to make Gavriel and the Caliph friends. I'm going to be using debug mode later on in this campaign for some interesting ways to shake up the campaign, but to be clear, I've not used debug mode or any mods to actually give myself any advantages or cheats. I'm just looking for good material to write about. As a once minority community, the Samaritans still very much live in fear. One of the first adaptations for this burgeoning community is to simply accept that they can even be a community. Acre had been their last bastion in the past couple decades, but finally the Samaritans can leave Acre for greener pastures. The city of Tiberias is still very much so an Arabic-speaking Muslim city, but over the next couple years, Samaritan Babylon will slowly disperse into the new city as granted to them by the Caliph. In terms of Gavriel's behavior, he's not looking to rely on the kindness of future Caliphs to maintain his people's freedom. I'd say he's going to plot against the realm. He doesn't intend to harm his friend and benefactor Mustansir, but instead he will work to undermine the institutions of the Caliphate such that they suit him better. The first step for that is to usurp the regency held by the Caliph's mother, Rasad. She's relatively disliked, which makes overthrowing her pretty simple. With the support of a couple sympathetic sheikhs, the regent's downfall was written on the walls. Alongside that, further blessings came to Gavriel in the form of a pregnant wife. He hadn't really considered the thought of lineage with his rulership over the Samaritans, but in many ways, establishing himself as an actual lord with a dynasty could further cement the legitimacy of the Samaritans as people of the realm to be respected. It was in February of 1068 that Gavriel usurped the regency for himself, and now he has quite the power in the realm, and his diarch is happy to have a friend ready to support him. As an immediate action, he began unlawfully taxing his fellow vassals. The Samaritans will need this money to establish new synagogues in other regions of Urdun. The initial period of regency composes a solid portion of Gavriel's adaptation to life as a noble. He suddenly has to interact with various Muslim lords across the realm, and he's been doing a good job getting used to it. He certainly has been using some of his privileges as regent to his advantage, often taking bribes from lords whenever possible, and out of fear, he himself was overthrown as regent by the Emir of Alexandria. Not looking to fail his people, Gavriel immediately escaped but did lose the regency. After assembling a respectable army, he went to revoke land from his Muslim vassal Lebanon so as to make more space for his Samaritan countrymen. In response to that tyranny, some of the local peasants rose up in rebellion. Tensions aren't particularly high where they matter though, given that the Levantine lords of Syria and Egypt don't particularly care about the dealings of peasants. By 1078, Gavriel controlled his entire realm in the name of the Samaritan people, and he was proud to consider himself the protector of his people. Back home in Acre, Gavriel hosted a feast to celebrate the growth of the community, but there was some sadness around Mount Gerizim continuing to be ruled by Muslims. Assuredly though, with enough good behavior, the Samaritans can earn the right to claim their holiest mountain. All they'll need is some power for themselves, and enough closeness to the Sultan for it to be a reasonable ask. Fortunately, the Sultan and Gavriel were very much so still close friends, but unfortunately, friendship does not carry on beyond the grave. The Shia Caliph al-Mustansir passed away, leaving one of his many sons, Abu Mansur al-Nizar, to rule. While Gavriel and Abu Mansur didn't have a rapport how the previous Caliph did, the new Caliph did respect the Samaritans' place as jizya subjects. That being said, there's no way he'd give up Jerusalem and Nablus when his own people hold both cities in high regard. Nonetheless, the quest to earn the approval of the new Caliph would be important if only to keep the Samaritans safe from any changes in administration. First off, the Caliph held a tournament in Jerusalem to celebrate his ascension to the throne. It's an opportunity for Gavriel to show his valor and to add a personal touch to his attempt at courting the Caliph's interests. Alongside that, all this work has been stressing the poor Samaritan leader out, and for that purpose, the tournament is quite convenient. The first event was an archery competition. The odds certainly aren't in Gavriel's favor, however he was able to pull off a win anyway. Perhaps it was God's way of showing him he was on the right path. Regardless of why he won, his victory earned him a cash prize, some recognition, and of course, an artifact. Next up were Games of the Mind, a board game tournament. For this competition, Gavriel was much better suited. He'd always been more of a scholar than a warrior, and against his first opponent, Suleiman, he won without any trouble at all. A great upset came to be though, as the second competitor, Yaqub, managed to defeat Gavriel. He took the loss well though, choosing to be humble so as to not upset the other lords. Jealousy wasn't an emotion Gavriel took to anyway. The shame of losing was lessened by the fact that Yaqub won the whole tournament. It was clear that he's quite the contender, and there's no shame to losing someone as talented as that. For his victory in the archery competition, Gavriel was given a beautiful necklace. It's certainly a lesser prize than he was hoping for, but he wore it with pride anyway. The most interesting effect of the tournament though actually had to do with how the Samaritans were viewed by wider society after it. By this point, Samaritans and Arabs get along relatively well, and the two have come to accept each other, at least as people. Religiously, tensions remain quite high, but outside of that, what's not to love about each other? If there's any form of identity that goes beyond religion or language, it's geography. The Samaritans and the Mashriqi Arabs share a home in the Levant, and their physical proximity has brought them together. The Torah and the Quran both make mention of the Canaanites, and although their exact makeup as a people is vague, it's that vagueness that makes the name and identity a perfect fit for the mixed inhabitants of the Levant. The new Canaanites of Tiberias, Lebanon, and Damascus have cemented themselves as an identity independent of Judaism or Islam, instead being united by their choice of home. Not every Bavalim of Acre was happy with this dilution of their identity though, and some tension arose between the more traditional people of Acre and the forward-thinking Canaanites. To help him clear his head, Gavriel took a trip to Antartis up in Tripoli so he could consider the right path forward. He would meditate and hope that God would give him the answers he's looking for. While meditating in the rolling hills of Tripoli, Gavriel was, for the first time in years, relaxed. Nature was truly beautiful, but that beauty was interrupted when visions of what could only have been a demon infested his mind. He shook off the scarring image, but when his eyes opened, a tree in the distance was struck by lightning. In its wake was a familiar, yet foreign symbol. A cross. The vision Gavriel had during his meditation would become one of the most important in all of Samaritan history, with the wise Canaanites immediately picking up on what the vision meant. The Gentiles of Europe had been rumored to be planning a great pilgrimage to Jerusalem for some time, but the rumors had always been just that, rumors. With the lightning strike and the tree though, God was telling the Samaritans that they must prepare for what was coming. Thankfully, the Samaritans weren't alone in the fight. Gavriel had established his community and himself as important pieces for the Caliph, as members of his community. The caliphal role as leader of Islam had expanded to becoming the protector of the people of the book that still lived within his land, and that included the Samaritans. As preparation for the coming flood of Christians, Gavriel met with his community in Acre. There were many ideas discussed. The Samaritans could attempt to fight off the hordes of Christians with their Muslim allies. They had some time before the Christians could organize a possibly send an invasion, so it wouldn't be an unviable option. They could abandon Canaan and go somewhere else, as often was the fate of their Jewish relatives. But this certainly left many dissatisfied. They had yet to live in Mount Gerizim, but to move even further away would be soul-crushing. Beyond that, they could live on as false converts to Christianity and betray the Muslims. This option was untenable though, on account of how close the two communities had become. Many families from both isles of the issue would never give up their closest friends. It was decided that if Canaan would have to be abandoned, there must be a backup location the Samaritans could escape to. It was up to Gavriel to find a new home for them, but he was stumped. Who would possibly welcome them into their lands unless they could make it worth their while? It would take a lot of gold, and who knows what else. For now though, an opportunity came up. The Byzantines were into turmoil, and one way to prepare for a Christian invasion would be to invade first, in the hopes of gaining some territory which could pay taxes and levy men to defend Canaan. As well, although it was a long shot, the Byzantines often fall to treachery and are quite cosmopolitan. Through the battlefield, Gavriel might find someone willing to act as a broker for a deal to secure land elsewhere in the world. The Byzantine route was indeed the idea, and Gavriel declared war for Antioch against the weak Vasilisa. She had no professional soldiers, only peasants with sticks who immediately fell to the well-trained Mubarzin and Shomer of the Canaanite armies. It was in 1095, early on in the invasion of Antioch, that the Western Christians declared their intention to crusade for the Holy Land. This was a disaster. The prophecy had come true, but all too early. Gavriel was far from prepared to fight off a horde of Christians, and he had yet to find any connections he could use to resettle his people. He focused on defeating the Romans for now, sieging down Antioch, Alexandretta, and Issus. He won every battle he fought, inspiring both his men and the enemy's men. The only opponents even worth fighting were the professional Varangian guards of the Emperor, but the Mubarzin easily outfought them. One particular opponent, a somewhat shady-looking Varangian who, if you believe him, was a brother of the late Harald Hardrada. Gavriel wasn't particularly familiar with the man, but he had heard he was a brave warrior for the Romans before eventually fighting a claim to a foreign kingdom across the sea. Either way, this Varangian, Halfdan he was called, offered his service to Gavriel out of respect for his leadership. Trust was not easily earned from opponents in the field, but considering the circumstances, Gavriel was looking for whatever out he could get, even if that meant working with a traitor. Halfdan was no vassal though, he was a mercenary. His intention was not servitude for honor's sake, but rather to find a mutually beneficial agreement for the two of them. Looking around at the carnage, Halfdan made an audacious offer to the Samaritans before him. "It seems to me you've got a problem on your hands, my lord. Everyone and their dog by now have heard of the Christians' plan, and there's no way you could think you'd defeat them. Indeed, you must be planning something. What do your people call it? I've read it in those holy books the Christians here always give out. In Exodus, isn't it? Oh, I've hit it right on the head, haven't I? You're in luck, my new friend, because I've got quite the opportunity for you. As the brother of the illustrious Harald Hardrada, and a member of House Yngling, I can promise you, on my honor, an audience with the king, Magnus, who I know would be more than willing to resettle some prospective foreigners in one of his favored fjords. Your offer intrigues me, Varangian, but given your proclivities, what are you hoping to get out of this? I doubt you're just looking for the honor of brokering a deal. Now you're the one hitting it on the head, your majesty. Indeed, I have but one ask of you." He paused, taking in the Samaritan's interest. In his eyes, he read desperation, and with that, read that he could ask for anything. "I want you to let me and my Varangian friends here burn Antioch to the ground and have our way with it." The look of abject greed and chaos flooded over Halfdan's eyes, much to the disgust of the bartering Samaritan, Gavriel. Presumably, Halfdan intended to raze Antioch to the ground and escape with its plunder for himself and his mates. That would mean a lot of innocent death for no reason beyond plunder. Killing, even for war, was already a contentious issue for many religious Samaritans, but to do so as a bargain with bloodthirsty mercenaries would certainly raise eyebrows. Gavriel understood how these sorts of people work. He takes the deal, or he loses the opportunity. He has no bargaining chips, and this Varangian has him in his grasp. The offer was tempting, and Gavriel had no time to meditate or confer with the elders over it. Antioch would either burn, or his people would be lost. It was decided. Antioch will burn. You have your deal, Varangian. Before you have your way, let me draft a letter to this King Magnus. I will trust you to hold your end of the deal. I wouldn't dare break a deal like this, don't you worry. Take your time with that letter, but I'm afraid my boys are already going to be enacting their end of things. Halfdan heaved his axe onto his shoulder with a hideous cackle, as a few dozen Varangians broke their lines in the Roman battle lines to head into Antioch. Not wanting to bear witness to the destruction you just brought onto those people, Gavriel drafted a letter to the King Magnus of Norway. Good King Magnus, I've made acquaintance with your uncle, Halfdan, of House Yngling. He and I have secured a deal wherein I get a chance to purchase some land in your beautiful kingdom into which my people may settle. I trust the riches of Antioch might be enough for you, but if you need more to secure the deal, I will not play around with you. I need a new home for my people. On whatever price you name, if it is within my earthly power, and if it is within the will of God, then it will be so that you are paid it in full. For the reason of my own limited power, I ask that you keep your price reasonable. The Christians will be knocking down all that my people have built within a short time, and your rapid response will mean everything for the future of my people. Kind regards, Gavriel of Canaan. With a furrowed brow, Gavriel handed the letter to Halfdan, who pocketed it, and then turned towards the already billowing smoke of the city of Antioch. I'll see you around, Gavriel. To be referred to by a simple first name without any title or honorific would have been insulting, not for exactly how important this random Varangian will be to the Samaritan people's future. Instead of standing on ceremony, Gavriel continued on the warpath, with the Roman lines watching from a distance in awe of what had just been done. With Antioch burning, Gavriel followed the retreating Roman army into Homs, where one last battle would decide the war. The battle was a landslide victory, and the Basilissa was even captured. This is perfect, given that Gavriel might need money to sweeten the deal for King Magnus. Rather than execute the Roman Empress, Gavriel sold her back to her people for whatever money she had left. Ironically, she passed away a few short days after being given back due to her wounds. The new emperor, Jonas, simply gave Antioch up. The city was a burning mess anyway, and the war was over. Defeating the Romans is always a cause to celebrate on account of their fame as fighters, but this victory felt wrong somehow. It was a precipitation of the upcoming need to move homes that slowly all the Samaritans were realizing would be coming. Somehow the idea that just by conquering Antioch and Alexandretta the Samaritans could assemble enough power to take down the Christians has infected the community, only for the disease of hope to be squashed out by the reality of exile. In 1097, the First Crusade for Jerusalem began in earnest, and Christians from across Europe landed in Gaza. The Caliph wasn't prepared, nor were the Samaritans. Although Gavriel wanted to fight, the hordes of Christians were overwhelming. As soon as they had landed, they had already taken the Dome of the Rock and Mount Gerizim. Things were grim, and no letter from Magnus had arrived by this time. It would have been useless to throw away the Samaritan lives to a Christian meat grinder, and so Gavriel put up no resistance. He instead chose to begin preparations for a long journey to the fjords of Norway. Perhaps a response from King Magnus would come on the way there. Either way, he was going to Norway. It was his only lead. Whichever Samaritans were willing to leave in search of a new home did leave, and the ones who would rather die near Mount Gerizim chose to stay. As Gavriel stepped out onto the boat from Tripoli, he spotted the very same tree that had told him about the coming Christian invasion all that time ago. The tree was still there, but it caught his attention because it was still standing despite how powerful the lightning from before had been. In a single moment though, with one foot on the plank of the boat, Gavriel saw it. The tree finally fell over. The cross has fallen. He stopped walking towards the boat. He turned to face the refugees before him, and without a word, marched south, drawing his sword. This was not the time for an exodus. No. This was the time for a pilgrimage. In his short-sighted, self-obsessed mania as leader of the Samaritans, Gavriel had forgotten an important detail about this crusade. It was between Muslims and Christians. As far as anyone else was concerned, Gavriel's people were just collateral damage in a conflict. That meant he had no diplomatic requirement to stay his blade. Striking the earth with great strength in every step, Gavriel marched on Jerusalem from Beirut. Moments after his march began, the Crusader Queen of Jerusalem, Ines, collapsed, assassinated by the ridiculous greed of the Crusaders looking for nothing more than loot. The new king, a mere boy, Herbert, was coronated, but during the ceremony, the horns of war took priority. The Samaritans were coming from Mount Gerizim, even if it meant the people of Antioch died in vain. First, Gavriel took Acre back. This was, for many of his flock, their only known home, and the relief that washed over the people upon its reclamation was immense. At the same time as their invasion, the local Canaanites, Muslims and Samaritan alike, rose up to shake off their Christian shackles. Unfortunately, they were looking for true autonomy and were to be put down like any other foe. After defeating a small populist army in Tiberias, Gavriel's army marched on Jerusalem, with Mount Gerizim in sight. Suddenly, what had been perhaps the lowest point in Samaritan history had turned around to become a peak. Jerusalem fell, and with Herbert held at sword point, the crown of Jerusalem was taken by Gavriel. At the age of 54, Gavriel has conquered Jerusalem, and with it, Mount Gerizim. He still has work to do, as locally entrenched Christian lords left to be displaced before they caused any trouble. Duke Saul of Urdun was first to have his land revoked. He wouldn't go down without a fight, but these sporadic Christian lords had no chance against the highly motivated Samaritans. Every Christian lord who fought against the lawful revocation of their titles was imprisoned, and stripped of all titles. Another round of lesser Christian lords rose up in rebellion over the revocations, but they too were put down. Jaffa, Acre, Tiberias, and Gaza were brought back into the royal domain, and now all that remained was to bring back the Samaritans in, to live their new lives in Israel. Until they can establish themselves as the new inhabitants of Jerusalem though, calling it Israel is a bit presumptive. The Canaanites have returned to Canaan and Israel, although it may take time for them to strike up new lives in what are effectively foreign lands. The new royal domain was situated in Jerusalem and its hinterlands, as well as the already majority Samaritan lands of Urdun. The Canaanites will begin settling into Jerusalem slowly, but first the need to assert control over the currently present population became paramount to Gavriel's ambitions. Unexpectedly, he also had to deal with his Greek subjects in Antioch who were not very happy with his decision about the Varangians. It was sad to think that the city had burned for nothing, as Gavriel no longer needed a place of exile, but he'd rather celebrate his victories than mourn his losses at the moment. The relative acceptance between local Mashriki peasants and Canaanite peasants meant the movement of settlers in Jerusalem went more smoothly than expected. Religious differences would certainly malign the people for some time, but the powerful theological skills of Gavriel helped to convince locals of the Samaritan Torah's legitimacy over the Quran. It was on July 11th of 1108 that Israel was declared in the stead of Jerusalem. Although the vast majority of what is now Israel still needs to be resettled and converted, the holy cities of Jerusalem and Nablus were converted, and and that's the most important. An important symbol of Israeli power, the Third Temple, would have to be on its way soon, although the funds for that were some ways away. Gavriel was in no rush though. As far as he was concerned, there were no threats nearby, as the Muslims were just happy to not have bloodthirsty Christians in their land, and the Romans had already been put in their place after Antioch burned. The Israeli king's immense hours spent studying the Torah and Samaritan history led him down a path of zeal. He had truly come to believe that his people were the chosen ones of God, and after having felt God's embrace, he was completely certain of his convictions. This would create a bit of a sensitivity for his relatively religiously diverse neighbors and subjects, but so long as he keeps his zeal to the confines of his own realm, it shouldn't ruffle too many feathers. As part of his newfound faith, Gavriel worked to wipe out his non-Jewish power holders from the realm, even further, reaching south into Negev and Kerak, the last bastions of Christian power. The war was short on account of the overwhelming power wielded by the elite Israeli men-at-arms. Negev's place as a Christian bastion was something of a stain on the purity of this new Israel, but they'd be converted soon, just like the Ismailis. Beyond secular matters though, Gavriel had more to think about. At the ripe age of 65, he led a healthy life, but his wife less so. She passed away rather suddenly, leaving the king to consider the ramifications of a future without his guiding hand. By now, he no longer consulted with the elders of Acre. Instead, he was the elder of Acre, or rather the elder of Mount Gerizim. Fear gripped Gavriel's heart. Could all this work be undone? His children were good, and he had many sons who he was certain would work together to maintain what he had built. But how many generations can the king influence? It only takes one weak link for the neighbors to smell blood. Adaptation. That was the answer. Adaptation not just for now, but for the rest of time. One day, while walking the streets of Jerusalem on the way to Mount Gerizim, Gavriel heard some local Mashriki merchants discussing the usual chatter as merchants do. Prices, weather, stories, and clients. They used a particular term which the king wasn't familiar with. In reference to the Samaritans, Mashriki merchants marked their clients down as the Dar al-Dhimmi. It was in some ways insulting, given that the term Dhimmi somewhat implies subjugation, but in many ways, Gavriel was willing to swallow his pride in return for a friendly disposition. It was often too easy to forget that his people, the Samaritans, were the minority in this region. It was then that it clicked for him. While he and his family are a temporary force in the world, there is a permanent force out there. God. While of course Gavriel can't influence God himself, he can influence the way God is interpreted, and by extension, the way his people interact with the myriad of other faiths. This Dar al-Dhimmi would become the new creed of the Samaritans, which might sound a bit heretical, but in reality the Samaritans only care about sticking to the proper Torah. Indeed, the original Samaritans and the Dar al-Dhimmi would still see each other as righteous. As a way to guarantee the future for his people, Gavriel ensured that Islamic influence would be allowed in small amounts, so long as the Samaritan Torah was not touched. He adopted a caliph-like role as the secular and spiritual leader of the Dhimmi world, and he allowed polygamous marriage as forms of Islamic influence. The Muslim world welcomed these sort of converts to the fold, and Gavriel took a sigh of relief. He had syncretized the faith of the locals and granted the Samaritans the power to make allies. He granted them at least a little security, although at the cost of the purity of the faith. On account of his immense reputation among Samaritans, no one batted an eye at this change, although for now, not every Samaritan accepted the changes to the faith. It would be a multi-generational process, of course. For his contribution to Samaritan history, Gavriel was able to consecrate his bloodline. In many ways, he's the savior of the Samaritans and the father of the Canaanites. At 70 years old, Gavriel the Savior felt well assured that his people would stand the test of time, even if his realm didn't. They could always become an accepted and perhaps even protected minority in the Muslim world if their realm wouldn't work out. The unfortunate thing about living to such a venerable age as Gavriel is the inevitable reality of outliving your loved ones. Gavriel's time is coming soon, but before he passed away, his own firstborn son did, leaving the inheritance to his grandson, Azaziahu. It's a bit scary to leave this fledgling realm in the hands of a mere child, but with youth also comes the time to gain experience. If anything, passing the throne to an already 50-year-old man might have made the realm even less stable. The final action Gavriel would take for his realm was spreading the new Dhimmi faith across both the traditional Samaritans and the remaining Muslims of the realm. In 1121, the legendary reign of Gavriel, the king of a restored Samaritan Israel, ended. 55 long years of struggle, near extinction, and then prosperity was passed along into the hands of the 10-year-old Azaziahu, who holds the same responsibilities as grandfather to the Dhimmi Samaritans. Childhood for a king is complicated, and that holds true even for the restored king of Israel. With his aunt Zipporah running things in the background, Azaziahu is focusing on his education and social skills. He's not nearly as skilled or learned as his grandfather, but who would expect that from a 10-year-old? While the guarantee of a secure realm was important to the long-term thinking members of the kingdom, some of the vulturous vassals saw an opportunity to demand reduced crown authority. Ultimately, a demand like this wouldn't be too painful to give into, but what matters more here is the appearance Azaziahu has as a king. He cannot be one that backs down. The Countess of Kerak and the Duke of Lebanon, who had been granted that land so kindly by Gavriel, rose up, but they will be put in their places. A few decisive battles and an occupation later, the war was over. It was so minor and so easily put down that it was a literal footnote in the Israelite chronicles in Uzziah's reign. For their crimes, the lords had their titles revoked, and they were replaced with new loyal lords. In some ways, minor rebellions like these benefit the authority of the crown, and it could be that those vassals gave themselves up to help project a sense of power to the world so that Israel's enemies won't strike. But that's pretty conspiratorial. Soon after the rebellion, Uzziah had his 16th birthday and grew to be a skilled tactician. He's a well-liked, just, and generous man, which is perfect to be the spiritual and secular leader of the Dhimmi world. He took on a wife of his preference, an Indian woman named Mahadevi. He also removed his aunt from power as she was no longer needed. Her time as regent was fine, and she stepped down without any friction. All is looking good for the new king's reign. Somehow, though, things can never be this perfect, can they? Well, the king certainly isn't thinking of that. Instead, he's going to go on a little vacation visiting Alexandria, Cairo, Mecca, Medina, and Mount Sinai. This pilgrimage will be a great way for the young king to see his neighbors and show his piety in climbing the very same mountain as Moses. The various cities he visited along the way were an opportunity to speak to locals and get an idea of the Muslim world's perception of his realm. While there was much respect for Gabriel on account of his personal relationship with previous caliphs, this new king would have to prove himself, it seems. No matter. Relations between the Muslim and Dhimmi world are strong for now. Heading home from Sinai, Uzziah wasn't really all that changed. The trip was a vacation, not a pilgrimage in many ways. Although he did go seeking spiritual enlightenment, he simply didn't find it. On the way back, he heard of his wife's pregnancy just as he was passing through Gaza. Mahadevi gave birth to a daughter, Mikayahu. With the new daughter and the new information about his place in the political world of the Levant, Uzziah offered a betrothal to one of the caliph's daughters. He's looking to keep the peace, and if he can legitimately marry into a family as powerful as the Fatimids, he'll be able to keep himself safe from both the Romans and the Turks. Surprisingly enough, the Turks hadn't actually invaded yet. Most likely, the barely functioning empire was focusing on its own internal affairs, and on account of that found no justifiable way to invade Israel. But the fear that a good emperor might be able to bring down the might of the Persian Empire was certainly scary. The Romans likely were going through a similar cycle of constant internal strife, as well as having been defeated relatively recently. There was security in the strife of others, and with that security came ambition. Gabriel had failed to amass the funds to construct the third temple in Jerusalem, but that didn't mean Uzziah couldn't fulfill his grandfather's goals in his behalf. Indeed, rather than investing in a stronger army, the Israelite king put his money into constructing a grand temple for his people. Coincidentally, the third temple's construction reached the Christian world within a matter of days, as suddenly, a new crusade for Israel was declared. This is not good. Panic swept through the people of Israel. The armors were out of practice, and the king without support. Although his marriage with the Fatimid Caliph did cement an alliance, the conflict was seen as one of Samaritans and Christians, which the Muslims did not want to get involved in. With about a year to prepare, Uzziah was not built for this kind of stress. He sat, awaiting the Christian armies, hoping that their fervor would be quelled or that they'd fall to infighting or any other intervention to stop them. Many Samaritans from Acre believed that this invasion was punishment for Gabriel's perversion of the faith, even though at the time they'd shown support. Oftentimes, in struggle, it's easy to tarnish the image of a once heroic figure if only to give a reason for the suffering. The Crusaders arrived at the coast of Gaza, and initially the Israelites saw success. The Crusaders were exhausted from their long trip and landed without the appropriate time to set up camp. The first battle of the Crusade was a resounding success, and with inspiration in their hearts, the Israelites marched north to meet the Danish Crusaders and the Knights Hospitaller, who were looking to land in Acre. Heading back south, the Crusaders that retreated into Egypt returned with a vengeance. This time, they were supplied and ready to fight. The battleground of Farama was worrisome. It was unknown land to the Israelites, and it was closer to the Crusaders' boats at the mouth of the Nile, who could continually supply more and more men for the fight. The Israelites, outnumbered 3-1, met their first defeat here, immediately swinging them into the war in the Christians' favor. Having retreated back to Acre, the army immediately swung back south to confront faction armies in Gaza. The Danish Crusaders were again defeated, but more Crusaders from Hungary flanked them in Petra. Enemies were coming in from every direction. More victories were won as faction armies continued to move into Israel, but the war was hitting a stalemate. Although the Israelites were claiming skirmishes, they were not winning any important enough battles to declare their victory, nor were the Christians taking any castles that could mark their invasion success. With enough skirmish victories, it is possible to win though, and assuming the Christians do not assemble a proper army, the conquest of Israel is not necessarily assured. Unfortunately in Negev, it was this that exactly happened. A seemingly simple skirmish evolved into a bloody battle as more and more Crusaders arrived. With that one battle, the momentum again swung in the favor of the Crusaders. Another battle in Negev went in the Christians' direction, and now the war is looking grim. The fort of Negev fell, and now Jerusalem and Nablus lay open to invasion. With the fort of Negev being taken, more Crusaders arrived, emboldened by the victories being spoken of back home. When the Danish Crusaders even managed to capture Uzziah in battle, morale sunk. Thankfully, before he could be dragged to Copenhagen, he escaped from his captors. Nonetheless, this war was clearly lost. While sitting in his throne room in Jerusalem, looking out the window at the Christian siege engines destroying his walls, Azaziyahu received a letter which his courtiers couldn't decipher. It was written in a language Azaziyahu recognized from his time in the Danish prison. This was a letter in Norse. Perhaps it was a preemptive ransom letter from the Danes? He opened it, unable to read it, but he saw a seal that was immediately recognizable. This was a letter from the King of Norway, Magnus, the very same Magnus that Gavriel had written to after the First Crusade all those years ago. It seems King Magnus finally got back to Gavriel, assuming he was still alive even. Maybe the letter got lost in transit. Perhaps Magnus had some kind of plot going, but whatever was going on, this letter had to be translated. Immediately, Azaziyahu brought in any literate Dane prisoner to translate the letter. Turns out, there was just one Danish prisoner who knew enough Arabic to try and communicate the letter's meaning. To the illustrious Duke of Urdun, Gavriel. Oh right, there was neither an Israel nor a Samaritan Jerusalem at this time. Azaziyahu chuckled at the humility of his origins. My dolt of an uncle, Halfdan, neglected to let me know about the deal you made with him until quite recently. I understand that you allowed him to keep his miserable life, and even rewarded him with the prize of Antioch. I say rewarded lightly, as we are a Christian kingdom. By the way, it's only the kingly way for me to be thankful towards your clemency. My family still very much carries the blood of our pagan ancestors, God forgive them. I'll be swift now. Your cry for help, I understand, was a time-sensitive matter. If my help is no longer wanted, simply throw this letter away. If it still is needed, I'm giving you a promise of safe harbor in my realm, so we may discuss what I can do for you. I understand my Christian brethren see you as monsters for your religious beliefs, but I choose the true path of Jesus, who would have returned a good deed with another. You are welcome in my realm. I hope this letter reaches you well and in a timely manner. Magnus, King of Norway. While the Danish soldiers certainly couldn't deliver the letter's message with the same regal speech as Magnus himself, the writing was noble and struck a chord with Azaziyahu. The letter wasn't even addressed to him, yet he felt the Norwegian king's presence all the same. This time the exodus seemed like it would be quite necessary. The trip to Norway, though, would not be easy. It's a long, grueling trip for a not-so-seaworthy people as the Canaanites. There are Crusader ships everywhere, and bandits along the seas. There are tempestuous storms, and the problem of not having the sort of Nordic technology to travel along rivers. While the Danes made their way here through the rivers of the steppes, Azaziyahu and his exiled refugees will have to travel through Gibraltar and brave the North Sea to find their way to reach Norway. They can't even find safe harbor once they pass Iberia, as it's unlikely that any Christian realm will give them a place to rest. With the sounds of mangonels bearing down on Jerusalem, and the still incomplete Third Temple's scaffolding falling to the earth, Azaziyahu hastily scrawled a route on a map. He'd follow the coast north to Alexandretta, then sail up and around the Crusader fleets. Once he reached the Straits of Otranto, he'd stop in Malta, where Muslim communities will hopefully welcome him. From there he'll cross into Tunis and rest briefly before heading to Sevilla for another stop to resupply. After that he'll go as far north as the Taifa's influence holds sway, resupply one last time, and then make the one-shot trip up north to Oslo. He could take this trip through the coasts along Normandy and Frisia up to Denmark, but it's unlikely he will find passage unscathed with that. He'll have to brave the North Sea, and he's certainly no sea dweller, but what choice does he have? Azaziyahu first loaded up his family onto the boat. It'd have to be one boat to keep a low profile. He then loaded up the original copy of the Samaritan Torah, much to the protest of the traditional Samaritans of Acre, but he was the new keeper of the Torah, not them. He then loaded up a collection of peasants, commanders, and stewards that he could use to create a sustainable enclave in Norway for his people. It's time to go. This will be a years-long trip, and the survival of each crew member is far from guaranteed. Jerusalem's walls fell a few moments after Azaziyahu fled the city, and the Crusaders put up their flag, celebrating their victory. They have won. The single ship that slipped into the night was the last hope of a free Dhimmi community. Luckily, the celebrating Crusaders were too busy sacking the city to watch the seas, and the escape was easy. Most of the crew was not used to seafaring, and seasickness was common. Morale was low, and even the king, Azaziyahu, was in low spirits. He's not as much of a leader as Gavriel, but he's trying. The obvious comparison to his grandfather, where Gavriel chose to stay and take Israel back, whereas he chose to run, was shameful. But this time wasn't so momentous. There would be a huge truce. The Christians were stronger this time. Ultrous Muslims might have snapped up the land before he could, and all sorts of other excuses were his copium. Nonetheless, copium they were, as even he knew a braver king would have held on in Antioch and fought. For now, the task at hand mattered more. He successfully evaded the Crusader fleets, but now he's in the middle of the Mediterranean, with nothing but the sun and stars to guide him. Malta should be straight ahead, but God only knows. They've got enough food for a few weeks of being lost, but no one wants to live off just bread and ale for this long. While at first the lowborn and highborn members of the crew remained relatively segregated, that quickly changed as boredom and the need to keep spirits up prevailed over social norms. Azaziyahu sat with a peasant, and over the weeks they discussed their struggles and worries. They're both just human at the end of the day. There was camaraderie to be had between people of a shared culture and faith, even if their places in the social hierarchy are so diametrically opposed. Azaziahu's willingness to be among his people was heartwarming for much of the crew, who had renewed faith in the success of their trip. After some weeks drifting in the hopes that the wind would bring them the correct way, a couple merchant ships bearing Maltese flags passed by, indicating they weren't too far. Land was spotted a few days later, and the ship roared with cheer. It was a Muslim port where they'd be welcomed, and there was peace, luckily. The Odyssey's first and easiest section was over, but it was still grueling. The exiled Dhimmi exited their ship to be welcomed as commoners by the Sicilian customs at the port. When they realized who was there, the Bey of Malta, Aidohu, was immediately summoned. It was certainly strange to see a Turk ruling this island off in the middle of the sea, but their people got around. Azaziahu did not speak Turkic, unfortunately, but he spoke Arabic, which facilitated translation. The Bey was flabbergasted to see a king come to his humble island and assumed the worst about the most recent crusade. Aidohu allowed the Dhimmi to stay as long as they needed, and Azaziahu took him up on the offer. It was an opportunity to let his infant son, Dan, experience at least some normalcy. The poor kid was only 3 years old, and he would need experience socializing to become a healthy child. There weren't many children in the court on account of Aidohu's age, but it was something. The Dhimmi stayed in Malta for a few months, enjoying the beaches and preparing for the next trip. They'd have to cross into Tunis first and find some skilled Berber sailors that could guide them through the Strait of Gibraltar. Malta was about as far as Azaziahu's sailors were even aware of the world, let alone could they guide the ship that far. Tunis wasn't far off though, so it would be a safe trip. Aidohu eventually let Azaziahu know that he should have enough food to make the trip to Tunis, and then off to Sevilla, and so Azaziahu gathered the crew and headed off to Tunis. The peasant man from before with whom the king spoke on the ship decided to try his luck staying in Malta. Azaziahu wanted to keep him since he'd need all the help he could get, but he's not in any position to force anyone to do anything. Losing even just one man was bad enough when only a few dozen were coming. Passing by Tunis, the crew once again were welcomed, this time by the Wali, Abdul, who wasn't quite an adult yet. He was accompanied by his mother, Tayert. The usual shock of the Israeli king showing up unannounced was still present, and before long, the Wali and his mother brought their best Berber sailors to guide the Dhimmis to destinations. Luckily, the entire coast of the Maghreb was ruled by the venerable Kapusa Kapusid, who had assembled quite the emirate by this point. Safety was guaranteed, which was a big sigh of relief. The trip to Sevilla was simple with the Berber sailors, and the peaceful Barbary coasts. The Dhimmi were allowed to fly the Sultan's flag to keep them safe from petty pirates, which worked perfectly. Arriving in Sevilla, though, was a different story. The Taifas were far from unified, and word of the Dhimmi Exodus was spreading quickly in the Muslim world. Arriving in Sevilla, the Dhimmi were welcomed by several emirs. Imran and his regent Hiyaz, from the Sevillan Taifa itself, Amir As-Saleh of Granada, who ruled Sevilla de facto, much to the chagrin of Imran, Yahya II, uncle of Imran, who felt it was his right as the head of the family to welcome these prestigious refugees, and finally Zafir, the Sultan of Valencia, who considered himself the most prestigious ruler in Iberia. Local politics were of no interest to Azaziahu, who only wanted passage up to Lisbon, but he'd have to make a choice as to which Taifa he'd allow to give him the privilege of a welcome. It was, in some ways, heartwarming to see that his people were not hated by the Muslim world, and that their place as a protected group was so well solidified, but at the same time, it was clear these lords only saw him as a political pawn in their own interests. Ultimately, it would be As-Saleh of Granada that Azaziahu would throw his lot in with, if only because he controlled the port itself. Once again, a few members of the crew chose to stay in Sevilla rather than to continue the journey. Their crew was down to just over a dozen members now as they headed off to Lisbon next. The trip to Lisbon should be safe, but something was off. The sailors were doing a fine job, but hostile-looking fleets were ominously following behind. The Sevillan sailors insisted they were a military guard, but somehow it didn't feel right. They felt more like spies or stalkers. Regardless, the trip is short, so danger is unlikely. The stalking situation carried on for some days, when suddenly along the coast of Lagos, pirate ships approached the ship, with clearly hostile intentions. These were no mere pirates though, they were equipped like royal soldiers, and among them was the recognizable face of Yahya II. Why was he here? Azaziahu ran his mind through what could be going on, and then it clicked. Petty local politics were, after all, quite cutthroat. Clearly, jealousy had overtaken the avaricious Yahya, who believed the right to escort the Dhimmi was his. If he couldn't escort them, he'd make it clear that the Granadan escort was not sufficient. In some sense, it was relieving, the thought that this was not actual piracy, but a political maneuver, but it also meant many would die needlessly. The pirate ship did approach, and with swords drawn, the well-equipped royal guards boarded and immediately cut down their Granadan sailors, as well as a few Dhimmi passengers. The emir, Yahya, boarded as well and spoke to Azaziahu. You made the wrong choice, siding with the Granadans. They illegally hold that port of Sevilla, and for your failure to recognize either me or my nephew as the rightful ruler of Sevilla, you will pay a dear price. I cannot have it be known that the Granadans took good care of you. I hope you can understand me, noble to noble. Yahya put his hand on the Israelite's neck, in a seemingly friendly way, But suddenly the warmth of blood, followed by the cold grasp of death, replaced that friendliness. Yaya's soldiers stabbed Azaziyahu in the back, straight through the heart, for an immediate, albeit relatively painless, death. This was a truly horrifying reality to come to fruition, as the infantile Dan at that moment became the king of the Dhimmi, and his mother, Mahadevi, watched, unable to do anything. Even the Dhimmi crewmates, who had stuck by the king all this time, could do nothing, as the intimidating royal guards stood ready to cut down any man who stood up. Yaya had more to say now that Azaziyahu was dead. Your people will be granted safe passage by me, Yahya Abadid of Algarb. The clearly inadequate Granadan guards have let you down, but rest assured, I will escort you to Lisbon, and ensure that the emir there, Ixfensen, will welcome you. Yahya took a seat in the middle of the ship, and for the last week of the trip, not a single word was spoken, as Azaziyahu's body was not thrown overboard, instead left to sit in the boat. Who would have thought such cruelty were even possible? The body attracted all sorts of flies and began to smell after a couple days, but clearly Yahya needed the body to prove that the king was indeed dead. While it's never right to judge an entire group of people for the actions of one, to say that these remaining exiles had their opinions of the Muslim world soured would be an understatement. Either way, they reached Lisbon in silence, while Yahya explained the story to the emir. Ixfensen prepared a burial for Azaziyahu and a new ship, clean of death, along with a map to Norway. He couldn't provide any skilled sailors, wishing the Dhimmi good luck, but nothing beyond that. The new leader of the expedition would, strangely, be passed along to Mahadevi, who was neither Canaanite nor Dhimmi. She was widely seen as a foreigner, but her leadership was needed, given the Israeli king, Dan's, lack of maturity. Mahadevi stepped up and led the crew, trying to remind them of their mission. They must establish a new life in Norway so they can one day come back to reclaim their home. She might not be one of them, but she cares for her son and his people, and for that reason alone, she will be there for the Dhimmis. With solemn attitudes, but somewhat renewed hope, the last leg of the journey from Lisbon to Oslo began. By God's grace, the winds were favorable, and the map Ixfensen gave to the crew was in Arabic and easy to read. The stars were easily visible, and the waters were relatively calm. The ship crested the Breton Peninsula, which was peaceful at this time, and the English Channel was pirate-free, as both the English and the Normans had been enjoying a peaceful trading life. The ship Mahadevi was leading, thankfully, had the appearance of a simple merchant ship, and no one bothered to give them another look. They were presumed to be Andalusian traders looking to sell their goods somewhere in Antwerp, most likely, given its importance as a trade hub. The ship passed right by, undetected, and without any trouble, but with recent events, risks felt a little more risky than usual. The coast didn't feel safe, when at any moment their ship could be told to dock and be expected by these Christians. They veered off the coast and into the famously tempestuous North Sea. From here, there were no coastlines, or fellow ships to rely on. It would be only the stars that could guide them. Mahadevi had no choice but to let the winds take the ship, and hopefully end up somewhere in Norway. The stars were so visible, and many of the faithful Dhimmi on the ship felt this was truly a divine intervention that they found their way here at all. With perhaps a little more faith, the coast of Norway will show itself. The North Sea was rough, but no one fell overboard. By this point, the trip had gone on for just over a year, and most of the expedition are used to being at sea, although they're certainly done eating only hard tack. Land was sighted after about a month in the North Sea, and Mahadevi immediately steered the ship towards it. This must be Norway. It has to be. The Rocky Mountains of Norway were easy to spot, but ports were few and far between for a landscape so inhospitable. Eventually they reached the coast, but no port. The map indicated they likely were somewhere just northwest of Oslo, but it was impossible to be certain with how rough the North Sea was. Having to pick going either up or down the coast, they decided to go down the coast. This was, thankfully, the correct choice, and before long a couple of the smaller villages along the coast before reaching Oslo flagged them down. Finally, the Dhimmi Exodus had reached Norway, albeit without their king. They were at first treated as shipwrecked on account of the disheveled state of their ship, but Mahadevi quickly presented the letter, which had the king's seal. None of the peasants were literate, but they recognized their king's seal. They weren't able to communicate, as no one here was bilingual in Arabic and Norse, so the peasants brought Mahadevi and her crew to the king, who at this point was no longer the King Magnus that had written them before, nor had Magnus been the king for a very long time, it seemed. The king of Norway at this time was Tord. It turns out Magnus had passed away long before the letter had reached the Israelites. Who wrote it then? Was it forged? It didn't matter, as Tord was still quite young. He was an honorable king though, who did recognize the seal, and therefore felt the need to give the Israelites at least something. He wasn't looking to do them too many favors though, given that these are in fact the much-hated Jews of Israel against whom a crusade was declared only about a year ago. Tord offered the Dhimmi some land on the very edge of his kingdom in the mountains of Nordland. It was something, but the Dhimmi were quickly dismissed with their land deed in hand and a couple wagons with enough food to make the trip north. It wasn't much, but they could begin the trek through the mountains and establish themselves somewhere, even if most would consider it nowhere. From here, the trip was simply long and monotonous. Nothing much really happened, as the supplies Tord gave the group were plenty to make the trip, and he even included some warm fur coats and enough tents and camping supplies to ensure that everyone was able to keep warm throughout the night. Eventually, Mahadevi reached the tract of land indicated on her deed. This land was called Bodin, and it was a frozen waste. A small river, more a creek, flowed through, although it was frozen at the time, and the next couple of years would be spent acclimating to their new land. Farming was by no means easy, but it was doable in the only somewhat chilly summers, and after a couple years of difficulty, New Canaan was declared. This was not at all a place which could be named after Israel, but it could be a replacement for Canaan at least. King Dan of New Canaan is 13 years old now, under the guidance of his mother, and he's carved his place out as the new king of the Dhimmi Canaanites. Some Norwegians have come into the community as farmers looking for work, but the majority of the counties of the Dhimmi and Canaanite culture, even if a majority refers to just over a dozen people. In 1147, Dan came of age, and now he rules a kingdom in northern Norway, which he pretty much has absolutely nothing going for it. He had to disband much of the men-at-arms he had brought with him, and most of them are laborers working to keep the land tended rather than fighting as soldiers. Dan's mother, Mahadevi, is still very much a valued counselor for the young man. Back home in Israel, Christians have been replacing the local Dhimmi and Samaritan peasants, except in Jerusalem itself, but time will only tell how long until that ends. Life in Norway is horrifically boring, but as part of the Canaanite way of life, music became a way to fill the hours of long days. Songs in Canaanite Arabic keep morale high. Most of them are about reclaiming the Holy Land one day and finding strength in faith. The question for Dan, now that he's got some normalcy out here, is what to do next. He's surrounded by militarily stronger neighbors who all hate him, and he's seemingly wasting away off in a fjord that's about as far from his true homeland as he can get. Alongside that, a new king, Valthjof, has taken the throne, and he's probably not looking to maintain the agreement his predecessor set up. It may be that New Canaan is already in danger of having to move again. Was coming to Norway a mistake, after all that struggle to make it over? News of politics in Israel continues to spread, albeit slowly, as merchants occasionally make their way to Bodin. Apparently the Muslims reconquered Israel for themselves from the Christians, which as far as the Dhimmi are concerned is quite an upgrade. The current king of Israel is Neriah, an Ismaili Canaanite. Hopefully he'll treat the Dhimmi well, but people say he's quite the religious zealot, and that might well spell doom for the now minority Dhimmi community. Unfortunately, the inevitable hostility of the Norwegians did come up. While one king might have accepted a Dhimmi enclave, the next did not, as Valthjof declared war to take Bodin back for his realm. While this might sound truly horrifying, the armies of the Dhimmi are not so easily defeated, and they have the mountains and the cold on their side. The first battle of the war was a loss, but far more Norwegians were killed than Canaanites, and being at home, the Canaanites can use their shomer to keep deaths low. With another lost battle, the Norwegians are down to about half strength, and the Canaanites have taken many injuries but few deaths. This war of attrition was very much so going to be drawn out, but in theory, if the Norwegians can never overtake the fort of Bodin, then the Canaanites will win this war, no matter how long it takes. Battle after battle took place, before suddenly the armies were looking pretty even. The Norwegians retreated back home, which was scary since more armies might be arriving if they can go home and reinforce. It turns out, though, a rebellion broke out on account of the king's perceived weakness, and suddenly New Canaan was left alone. For a few years, the Norwegians didn't return, until they did, and the same process of battle upon battle happened, but by this point, Norway will have to occupy Bodin if they want to declare victory. In 1167, the war was over, with a Canaanite victory, as unlikely as it might have seemed. The plan was to demand war operations from the king to end the war, and then to use that money to escape one more time. Where the Canaanites will go is not known, but it's clear that a home here is no longer an option. That was until Mahadevi brought up a letter she received from the council. She said one of her distant cousins in Sindh was willing to give them a new home, temporarily. It would be a long journey, but the promise of land in an actually prosperous part of the world meant everything to the Canaanites. At first, the Dhimmis of Bodin were upset to hear they had to pick up and travel treacherous seas once again. Mahadevi read one detail in her letter that changed everything. Apparently, the king of Sindh is, for some reason, a longboat proficient Seculo Norman. How the Sumra family of Muslim Sindhi kings came to be a family of italicized Normans is a mystery of history that only the Sumra themselves could know, but Sultan Vitu Fitz Rainer of the Sumra clan nonetheless extended his welcome to his relative Mahadevi, after he heard about their plight in Norway. Turns out news in the Norse world gets around. Finally a way out for good, and somewhere both more prosperous and closer to Israel. The skilled Norman sailors arrived in their longboats off Bodin and took the Dhimmis who were willing to go off towards Sindh. The trip was safe and uneventful in the most welcome way possible. The Dhimmis were tired of adventure. After just over a year's journey, it was October of 1168, and the Dhimmi once again were resettled, this time along the Indus in Sindh. Similarly to when they arrived in Bodin, Dan spent the first couple years just focusing in on acclimating to the new home. He had his first son, Shilach, in 1173, although the poor boy was cursed with a truly hideous face. It was also shortly after that the legendary Mahadevi passed away, leaving Dan without his beloved mother, and without one of his most valued connections to the Indian world. Ranikot has become a new epicenter of Canaanite life, but with the comfort of the Indus River, Dan has decided something. He will not simply adapt. It is clear now, with his strength mounting, and with his safety mostly assured, that Israel must be reclaimed. He's a bit old at 53, but it's the only way to reclaim the pride of the Dhimmi people. Israel must be reclaimed. Israel is now ruled by the Egyptian Sultan Ezra from the offshoot Bilbazid cadet branch of the Fatimid family. He's strong but not as strong as the highly motivated Dhimmis. Thankfully, this place is not like Norway. There are friends to be made here, and there is a schism amongst the Muslims. The Sunni Seljuks and the Shia Fatimids are opposed, and although in the past the friendship between the Samaritan community and the Shia Caliphate was a powerful one, that friendship is no longer on the table. It was time to align with the Sunnis in the hopes that they could bring the Dhimmis the prosperity they need. It was a Sunni Muslim, Yahya, that had killed Azaziyahu back in Iberia, but previous crimes could be forgiven if it meant reclaiming Israel. No one questioned that Azaziyahu would want Israel reclaimed. The hideous son, Shilach, was to be betrothed to the Seljuk princess, Arin. The Seljuks had an interest in weakening the Egyptians, who up to now had mostly free reign across Arabia and the Levant. This alliance was formed, and the war was declared in 1189. One last favor from the Seculo-Norman hosts of Sind was a collection of ships for the Dhimmi armies to go into, as the Sumra family wishes the Dhimmi best of luck on their quest. The Seljuks answered the call to arms, and the Dhimmi arrived in Negev. Initially, the Fatimid army was able to crush the Dhimmis. They were powerful and well-paid soldiers, but the Seljuks will surely crush them once they arrive. Only problem is that the Seljuks are seemingly stuck in the Levantine deserts. They're wandering about, unable to figure out how to get to Israel. After a bit of a delay, they did find their way in, though. Thankfully, the Turks met with the Dhimmi in Kerak, and now victory was assured. Hordes of Turkic soldiers backed up the Canaanite soldiers, and the walls of Kerak were quickly falling. Negev and Jerusalem fell while the Egyptians freed Kerak meaninglessly. The first victorious battle of the war took place at this fort, and once the recently reclaimed fort fell again, the Fatimids surrendered and returned Israel to its rightful owner. Israel is restored, and the capital is back in Jerusalem. The minority Samaritan and Dhimmi communities of Israel were free to repopulate the kingdom, and the remaining Christians were slaughtered for their crimes. While Dan felt it was probably better to forgive than to punish, he really couldn't control the lynch mobs of Dhimmis looking for revenge after a hard life in Norway and shameful exile across the seas. To celebrate the Dhimmi return, Dan built a grand temple in Acre, and to quell people's rage, he decided to put their pain towards something more productive. Tolerance was no longer the way of the adherents to the Torah. The Fatimids were no longer allies. Instead, Egypt, the land which once enslaved the Israelites, will become its breadbasket. Using the Seljuk alliance, Dan declared a holy war for the entire kingdom of Egypt. While initially Jerusalem was under siege, once Turks arrived, the siege was easily relieved, and an offensive into Sinai Peninsula began. The holy sites of Alexandria and Mount Sinai were both up for grabs here, and obtaining them will serve to embolden the Canaanites immensely. After Cairo fell, and after the Turks defeated the Egyptians in battle after battle, the war was over, and the Fatimid Caliphate went from the main power of the Levant to an irrelevant sultanate of Arabia. Simultaneously, Israel is now the premier power of the region, with a ton of Muslim subjects. The lands of Egypt were given out to Dhimmi Canaanites to rule, and local Egyptians were in a tough spot. They were important to the functioning of society, given their massive size, but they were regarded as foreigners by their new lords. By controlling the rich Nile River and extracting heavy taxes from Egyptian subjects, Dan was able to create immense wealth that he intelligently reinvested into building up Israel and his armies. Although at first he exploited the Egyptians, it eventually became clear that they were far too important to the functioning of Israeli society to be treated as lesser. Instead, the peasants of Egypt and Israel worked together to farm, build, and fraternize. The identity of the Canaanites and Egyptians became intertwined, and now known as the Tajali. I got that word by Google translating the word wander into Arabic and then adding an I at the end to make it fit English grammar. I figured the Dhimmi by this point would be well known for their wandering nature, and the Egyptians, although quite sedentary, were closely associated with Bedouins, who were also pretty nomadic. The Tajali people started off in both Israel and the estuaries of the Nile up to Alexandria. Traditional Canaanite lands were relegated to Damascus and Lebanon, as well as in Kerak and Negev, where the mountains kept the culture conservative. Up to the Nile River, more sedentary Egyptians held on to their own culture, avoiding the melting pot for now. A stark change in the attitude of the Dhimmi world happened by this point. It became clear that no longer were the Israelites a low people, tolerated by those around them, but instead a high people who have the choice to tolerate those below them. The Military Academy of Jerusalem was founded in response to this new attitude, as the Dhimmi considered whether or not to keep conquering new lands for their people. They have the Holy Land, Mount Gerizim, Sinai, Acre, and Alexandria, and have dethroned their old Kemetic slavers. What more could the world hold for them? Something of an early industrial revolution and military revolution took hold of Israel. Windmills, water mills, academies, and universities popped up everywhere. Israel was to become a rich, educated, and imposing nation under the leadership of their spiritual and secular king. It's 1204 now, and Dan is among the greatest of Israeli kings alongside Gavriel for his work establishing the powerful Israeli kingdom. The accursed Christians who previously inspired fear in the Israelites once again came knocking with a crusade, but this time the feeling was different. There was neither fear, nor worry, nor stress, nor even a thought given to these crusaders. Do they really think they stand a chance against the now strong Israelites? The military academies of Jerusalem and the immense wealth of the Nile River would come together to defeat any crusader army. Above all, the holiness of all the holy sites of this kingdom meant God was on the Samaritan side, of course. In 1206, the first Crusaders arrived in Gaza, mirroring what had happened so many years ago. But this time the Crusaders were absolutely swept away, with most of their bodies ending up back in the water they came from. Not a drop of mercy was allocated for the Gentiles, who had no idea how powerful God's chosen people had become. A few months later, more Crusaders arrived and faced the same fate as their brethren. After just a year and a half of war, the papal cross was broken, and the Crusaders were sent packing. Israelite hegemony is guaranteed from here on, with both the Muslims and the Christians put in their places. Further conquest was on the menu, and Dan looked to take the unlawfully held bit of land off in western Egypt from local North Africans, which was a bit of a tougher battle than he expected. One day, while overseeing the war, Dan leaned a little too far out the window and fell to his death. Let it be always known that no king, no matter their power, is immune to nature, or the invisible forces that keep the world running how it does. At 78 years of age, Dan passed away, leaving Israel to his youngest son, Ittai, and Egypt to his eldest son, Shilach. The two siblings, Ittai and Shilach, were officially kings of their own realms, but they ruled the two kingdoms like diarchs. Step outside the story for a second. I believe it's a glitch that my regent was my brother while he was also the king of Egypt. I'm pretty sure you normally can't have a landed regent that's not in your own realm, but for the purpose of roleplay it was amazing. And I think it'd be cool to have diarchs like this in the game. Something that didn't make sense was that Shilach of Egypt had no regency, while I did. Again, not sure if this is a bug or not, but Shilach is my regent. Kinda cool. The sudden death of Dan led to a stalemate in western Egypt, as Ittai felt the conquest of what was ostensibly his brother's land was no longer necessary. Instead, Ittai went after some of the independent emirs in Jordan and Syria. They were easy targets, and could act as buffer regions against Seljuks. It was uncertain how the Persianized Turks of the former Persian Empire felt about recent Israeli conquests, better prepared than wondering. In 1217, Ittai had his first child, Yehoshua, who immediately showed quite the intelligent affect. Instead of Yehoshua, Ittai changed the kid's name to Nathaniel. Somehow the name just felt more fitting. News of the Mongols was spreading around the region, but their conquests were, while impressive, mostly irrelevant to Israelite interests. With Genghis Khan dead, his son Jochi wasn't someone anyone felt much fear of, although only time could tell if the Mongols would become a threat to Israeli interests in the near future. Instead, this would be a period of true peace for Israel. Ittai was focused on building up the architectural and economic prosperity of the Holy Land rather than fighting anyone. He had his fill of initial conquests in Syria, but now he and his brother are going to focus on the custodianship of Mount Gerizim, as ought to be the most important task for any Dhimmi ruler. It turns out that Ittai's time as king of Israel was short-lived though, as he died of a random seizure in 1231. The time he did rule was a time of prosperity enjoyed by all, but his life was ultimately uneventful. He left Israel to his son, Nathaniel, who was almost an adult. He split the domain with Nathaniel's brother, Yedidia, who was around the same age. The timing was rather unfortunate though, as just after Ittai's death, the Mongols made a return to form that was rather unexpected. The Seljuks, who previously were the hegemons of the Near East, were defeated by Jochi and his armies, pushing them out of Persia and Babylon. It turns out Jochi was both rich and powerful, and ready to use that power to push through the Muslim and Jewish world as he saw fit. Looking for guidance, the recently grown Nathaniel took a trip across the various holy sites of his faith. He took a trip to Al-Hila off in Iraq, but before going he stopped by Alexandria, Mount Sinai, Damascus, and Antioch. While traveling through Iraq to see Al-Hila, Nathaniel got an idea of the savagery of the Mongol invaders. Their warpath left death, destruction, and a general disorder where they went. And yet, in that destruction, there was safety. In regions the Mongols considered to be theirs, bandits disappeared, and merchants got around safely, albeit paying heavy tolls. He decided to take a detour before returning home, heading into the Zagros Mountains to Isfahan to see how life is over there. He found the same outcomes to the people there too, as eerily quiet villages dotted the path to the once bustling city of Isfahan. Nathaniel heard news of the complete collapse of the Seljuk Sultanate, which could no longer claim itself to be the successor of the Persian Empire. The lords of Syria and Armenia were in disarray as a power vacuum opened up between the Mongols, Israel, and the Romans. The Mongols quickly snapped up Jazeera and eastern Anatolia, leaving only Syria open to the Israelites, while the Romans shook in fear at the Mongol raiding parties that began to sweep through their land. During this time, Nathaniel had mostly forgotten about his cousins in Egypt as he focused on affairs to the north and northeast, but eventually received word that the warrior queen of Nubia, Yanina, had taken Egypt from his family. This was certainly an unexpected outcome, but it clearly couldn't stand. It seemed like these Coptic Christians were far more tolerant than their Catholic compatriots, but it was certainly scary to have enemies on all sides. Immediately, Nathaniel declared a war to take back Egypt, and luckily the Nubians were no match for the superior Israeli soldiers. Those military academies were proving their usefulness, as the Israelite commanders could outdo anything the Nubians had up their sleeves. Egypt was reclaimed before any damage could be done, and Nathaniel refocused on the important issue of the Mongols. First off, he would snap up the remaining Syrian lords and fight the Romans for control of Alexandria. This was to ensure that the Mongols didn't get it first, and so the Romans wouldn't get any opportunistic ideas when the inevitable conflict did break out. Once a large portion of Syria was conquered and the Mongols seemed busy with other invasions, Nathaniel saw his opportunity. The Mongols are numerically superior, but they're much more widely spread. It's unlikely they can respond to Israeli aggression before the Israelis can effectively declare a victory and take Jazeera. This was exactly his plan. Nathaniel conducted a lightning war as he knocked down wall after wall and assaulted poorly kept forts manned by locals with no morale to support a Mongol administration. Before the Mongols could assemble an army to respond, the war was over and Jazeera was conquered. By no means whatsoever did this mean the Mongols were defeated, but at the very least they were being challenged and they had to respond in due time. The rest of Syria was taken, and then Nathaniel rewrote Israeli succession to better suit the long-term interests of his realm and family. He changed things over to primogeniture before conducting a few more minor conflicts with the Mongols and other errant Arabic neighbors. This was the zenith of Israeli power, but it was fragile in the face of such a massive empire. Indeed, the Mongols this whole time were just sizing up their Israelite opponents and had been planning their return soon. The Mongols were completely accepting of this upstart kingdom's power, as they knew it wouldn't last. The Khan appointed his best Keshik to solve the problem, Borjigidai Noyan. The Mongols are a patient and forbearing people. Panic is an unknown idea to them, and the long war was often their specialty. This was no different for Borjigidai, the favorite general of the great Khan, Ambagai. Borjigidai was given one command: neutralize the Israelis by any means possible. He was granted all the land in the Fertile Crescent as both the means and the reward for his task. Ambagai was a hands-off sort of Khan who trusted his favorite Keshik to get the job done, without much guidance. Borjigidai agreed. He first divided up the land amongst his own soldiers and surveyed the land he was granted. These were rich territories, and he could easily raise a powerful army from here. He married a skilled administrator, Tashi, who he would assign the job of both raising his children and overseeing his land while he was off campaigning. In order to keep up with the Israeli military tactics, he held a council with local Monarchy community leaders that had been feuding with the Israelites for decades. They explained the recent innovations of trebuchets, crossbows, and new fortification techniques which Borjigidai adopted into his own mind. He knew he'd have to adapt to the way of life of the people here if he had a chance, and thus Baghdad became a synthesis of Iraqi, Arabic, and Mongol culture. The first step to figure out how to defeat the Israelites would be to lose to them a few times. Borjigidai began raiding the border territories between Mesopotamia and Jazeera to draw out the Israeli armies. The response time was immensely fast, and it was clear the army was massive. Rather than take a needless loss, he took his army back to safety of the Great Khan's realm and moved south to raid smaller Bedouin states. He reported his findings to the Great Khan so far and discussed the new Monarchy technology he'd acquired. As a reward, Ambagai sent him some several thousand gold and gave Borjigidai the order to continue developing and building up his domain in preparation for an invasion. The money was immediately invested into new Mongol military academies to rival those of Jerusalem and Tiberias. Meanwhile, the Great Khan was working on conquering the Romans, both Holy and Eastern. Ambitious for sure, but this was more of a diversion to let Borjigidai focus on sizing up Israel. The diversion worked, as the Israelites assumed the Mongols were busy. They went to fight their new Nubian enemies, and seeing an opportunity to sow chaos, Borjigidai raided Jazeera from top to bottom. Eroding the people's trust in the Israelites to protect them was central to defeating them, as the power of any ruler came from the support of the individuals that tended to the land. As well, the gold and treasures would embolden his own men and inspire courage in them. Sensing that the Israelites were too busy to respond, Borjigidai moved into Syria, pushing the limits of his own army's comfort. Most feared an Israelite reprisal, but none came. City after city fell as castle after castle surrendered. The Mongol horde reached Beirut and left it in shambles. Jerusalem was near, and the Temple of Acre was within sight, but was it wise to attack the heart of Samaritan society like this? Of course it was, Borjigidai thought. He had to draw out the Israelites in a rage that they would fight unwise battles out of their pride. If there's anything he knew about these Hebrews, was that they thought themselves above others. A Mongol knew that no man is above any other, except insofar as he can prove it on the battlefield. The ancient cities of Tyre and Acre burned, followed by the surrounding cities and forts of Jerusalem. The ultimate desecration occurred as Borjigidai personally oversaw the destruction of the sanctuary in Mount Gerizim. The people of Israel hadn't seen cruelty like this since the Christian Crusaders first arrived, and the prosperity of Jerusalem in one fell swoop was eradicated. With coffers completely full of beautiful gem-encrusted menorahs and fires behind them, the Mongol army marched back to Baghdad with pride. Most importantly, Borjigidai took notes on the fortresses he burned down and applied their ideas to his own fortresses along the Israelite border, shoring up whatever weaknesses he himself had exploited. As quickly as they had left, the raiding party immediately returned, capitalizing on a fearful populace, which had no way of informing their king that they were in danger. Apparently, Nathaniel of Israel was too busy fighting the Nubians to care for his subjects back home. That, or the Mongols had done a good enough job ensuring not a single messenger could escape the city limits. Borjigidai reported his raiding success to the Great Khan, who tentatively asked if now was the time to invade. Borjigidai thought it over. The answer was yes, and Ambagai declared an invasion to take Israel. Immediately, Israeli soldiers came to Jerusalem, only to discover it had already been burned down, that the army responsible was still around. Now Nathaniel was willing to give up on his fight with the Nubians to come and save his kingdom, but it would be some time before the army could find their way back home from Nubia. Gigachad assumed the Great Khan could handle this war on his own, but looking to show his great dedication to the Khan, he joined the war personally, at no benefit to himself. To him, this is what it meant to show true subservience. Besides, it was a good opportunity to try out these new bombards he had just purchased from the Romans. Carving a path of destruction through Jazeera and into Syria, Gigachad let the Great Khan's army distract Nathaniel while he struck at the important cities of northern Israel. The Israelite army, realizing they had been hoodwinked, turned around from Jazeera and marched south back to Syria, suffering in the sweltering heat and running low on supplies after so many skirmishes with the Mongols. It was too little, too late though, as Nathaniel was forced to surrender after losing too many important cities across his empire. The Israelite armies did catch Gigachad's forces, but the Great Khan's armies were already marching back into Syria, and the war was lost. Israel, as powerful as it was, is gone, relegated to the little piece of Nubia that they took, which cost them everything. Israel was stuck in Nobatia, with a massive Mongol army looming over them. For his immense contribution to the conquest and the defeat of the only nation to pose a threat to the Mongols, Gigachad was allowed to keep all the wealth he had taken and was written into the secret Mongol history alongside the likes of Subutai and Genghis Khan himself. Meanwhile, Ambakai was celebrated for his excellent choice general, and the two bonded over their mutual benefit. Panic ran through the Israeli court, which had taken up a temporary residence back in Ranikot. This was the old capital when the Israelites were in exile in Sindh, but it was clear that this little bit of land was not enough to possibly reclaim Israel. How Nathaniel planned to reclaim Israel was impossible to say. He'd lost everything, and didn't exactly have the world's sympathy unlike his ancestors. For the recent Israelite aggression that he'd overseen, the rest of the world felt he'd gotten his comeuppance, and to some extent they may have been right. Nonetheless, he couldn't give up. It would bring too much shame to his family. Instead, he would adapt. Immediately, the vassals of Nobatia were removed from power, and unimportant relics were sold off to make money to support the army. Despite having just been defeated, Nathaniel hoped he could take the Mongols by surprise by immediately declaring war to retake Israel. It was quite a gambit, as clearly the Mongols were more powerful than him, but with some luck, they might be off celebrating and not paying attention to the possibility of an immediate Israeli response. He marched his armies up the Nile, occupying up to Cairo uncontested. It looked like the plan was working, as the Mongols hadn't even surveyed Egypt, let alone asserted their authority enough to levy an army in defense. After crossing into Asia through the Sinai Peninsula, Nathaniel believed he was in the clear, although he was blissfully unaware of the Mongol armies that were invading Ranikot, as he was off campaigning in Israel. Turns out the Mongols were aware of his war and were hoping to get him in his own capital before he could reach Israel. They overestimated how long it would take though, and Nathaniel reached Jerusalem once more. He was able to secure enough of a foothold to move his court back to its true capital before Ranikot fell, and thus the now king of Egypt rather than Israel reclaimed the de facto land of Israel. He needed to recuperate some of his authority before once again becoming the king of Israel, but the real question was how long the Mongols would tolerate this rebellious enclave. It could be an okay idea to swear fealty to the Mongol Khan, accept his overlordship in return for protection, similarly to the place the Samaritans once held in the Fatimid Caliphate, but that felt wrong. How could his people submit to any other after all the work they put in to never do so again? For now it seemed this tenuous situation would be allowed to go on as the Mongols were in a civil war. It seemed Gigachad, the Keshig that caused the Israelite downfall, got a bit ambitious and ended up conquering more of Arabia and then getting his independence from the empire. Why the brilliant general betrayed his Khan is anyone's guess, but it only worked in Nathaniel's favor. Shortly after the civil war, the Great Khan passed away and his empire split in several much weaker and fractured versions. Thank goodness, as now Nathaniel had nothing to worry about. The Mongol Empire was not composed of the Mongol homelands under Inancha, the Buddhists of Oighur under Ogadai, the Christian Eastern Europe under Jebe, and surprisingly enough, two Dhimmi Khans, Berka of the Ilkhanate and Chagatai of the Barun Khanate. Although Dhimmis, there was still fear that these Mongols would be as power-hungry as their pagan ancestors. Nathaniel had a plan though. He could reclaim his honor with one move. He would lay claim to the Barun Khanate and to the Ilkhanate, citing his overlordship of all Dhimmi people as their spiritual leader, and he could create an Israeli empire larger than any he had ever seen. He first invaded the barely established Barun Khanate, which fell so quickly on account of their lack of organization. Chagatai Khan barely had time to arrive in the capital, Alexandria, before it was occupied, and he was forced to give up his throne. This new fledgling empire, Nathaniel called Magna Israel, choosing a Latin name to assert himself in the minds of the civilized world. Next was the Ilkhanate, which, while more organized than the ill-fated Barun Khanate, had similar issues. The highly experienced and well-studied Israelites made short work of the barely functioning Ilkhanate army. Without a worthy Khan to lead them, these Mongols collapsed easily. A 7-month campaign resulted in the entire Ilkhanate falling to the Great Israeli Conquest. This also meant Ranikot and Jerusalem were now connected by a land border, funnily enough. There's only one man left who had to pay for his crimes against the Dhimmi, and he would be the toughest of them all. the architect of Nathaniel's great embarrassment, Gigachad. Perhaps he had abandoned his Khan because he knew that upon the Khan's death this all would happen, but regardless of why Gigachad struck out on his own, he now had to contend with a much more aggressive and vengeful Israel. Though the vast resources of the Great Khan, Gigachad's army fell to the Israelite military relatively quickly, and Baghdad fell soon after. The city was razed and burned without any mercy, as this city was the product of the looted wealth of Jerusalem. It did not deserve such status. From here, Nathaniel calmed down. He had reclaimed his pride and put the Mongols in their place. Now he could relax, as there was no more threats to his people, his realm, or his honor. He proved that he could stand amongst his ancestors as a man of competence and pride. As things settled down, Nathaniel got to work smoothing relations over with his new diverse suite of vassals across the empire. It would take time to heal the wounds of history, but there was only one way he could help things along. The Dhimmi community has, for too long, kowtowed to those they believed were their superiors. Often these Samaritans compromised their beliefs for survival's sake, and the ancient communities of Acre often warned against the adverse effects of polluting the faith in such a way. Nathaniel would ensure that would never happen again, as he left one last mark on the Israeli world. Nathaniel reformed the faith one last time, creating one true form of Judaism that followed the only true Torah, the Samaritan Torah. This religion would not tolerate syncretism, heresy, nor heathenry. The truest form of the Israelite faith, Old Testament Judaism, was born out of the strife of the Mongol and Israelite clash. While willing converts were welcome, this faith would be one under which the vassals of Magna Israel would either submit or be killed. Tolerance was out of the window for all but the Dhimmi, who were still seen as proper Samaritans. For fear of losing their lives, the diverse vassals of the former Mongol Empire submitted and converted to Old Testament Judaism, the one true Judaic faith. This marks the end of the story for the Acre Samaritans. From humble beginnings under the Fatimid Caliphate to complete domination of the Middle East, these Samaritans went through immense difficulty to get where they are now, but it was certainly worth it for them. Whether it was under the thumb of the Ismailis or in the harsh winters of Norway, they never lost their faith in God and knew that one day they'd return to Mount Gerizim. Nathaniel died at the venerable age of 75, shortly after reforming the faith, leaving his grand empire to be ruled by his lineage for as long as they can hold it together. Whether or not Magna Israel will stand the test of time is yet to be seen, but what is certain is that the Samaritans will go down in history as an important shifting of the balance of power in the Near East, and their impact will be felt throughout history for centuries to come. So that's the story of the Samaritans. I hope you enjoyed the video. This was my most ambitious project yet, and I had a blast both researching and writing for it. If you enjoyed it, consider commenting, liking, subscribing, all that, etc. Check out my Discord if you want to chit-chat about anything. You can expect more CK3 content in the future, as I took time off during summer to enjoy some time with friends, but I'm getting back into more regular content creation now as I come back with a renewed passion. Looking forward to making more videos for you. Thank you for your time.